Hello, this is the principle of dominance and law of segregation. Now we know that sexual reproduction needs the input of two cells, or gametes, from the mom and one from the dad. These are the gametes right here. They come from the male part of the flower, that would be pollen, and tucked down into the female part of the flower would be the ovule. Now, when the gametes come together, they're going to form something called a zygote, which is just a fertilized cell. And that zygote will eventually become the offspring, which would be a brand new, beautiful, bouncing baby flower in this case, because I personally don't want to draw any other pictures for you. But it will be just like the mommy and the daddy. There you go. Now, to understand the principle of dominance, let's first look at one trait of these flowers, which is the color. The dad flower came from a family of flowers where everyone had purple flowers. The mom flower, she came from a family where everyone had white flowers, and they'll proceed to cross their pollen and make a baby flower. Now you can see the gametes have come out. They have formed a zygote, which will then form into our baby flower, which is going to look pretty much just like the parents, except for something kind of special. And that is, what color petals will this baby flower have? Well, it turns out that if Dad has always come from a family where all the flowers are purple, and Mom comes from a family where all the flowers are white, the baby flower will have purple petals, just like Dad. And that means that purple is a dominant color in this particular family tree, in this particular situation. Purple is the dominant flower color. And so baby produces purple flowers. The way we would say this is purple is dominant to white, and white is recessive. Now, if that were the case, and that were all you saw, you might think that white flowers would become extinct, but they still exist. And Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, figured out how this was possible by coming up with the idea of every trait in every organism having two alleles. For the father flower, he has two dominant purple alleles, and the mother flower has two recessive alleles, which are still abbreviated P for the dominant color purple, but they represent the white color. Now, when these flowers make their gametes, the alleles will split up or segregate into each individual gamete, like this. This represents the law of segregation, that when gametes are formed, each allele separates or segregates from the other into the different gametes. Now, when fertilization occurs, this becomes a bit more complex. Now, if we follow the pattern, for instance, the black pattern, or the red pattern, or the green pattern, or any other pattern, when this parent fertilizes with this parent, the result is always going to be a dominant allele with a recessive allele in the offspring. And when Mendel crossed his pea plants, he found that all of the offspring from a purple flowered plant and a white flowered plant that were true breeding would always produce purple offspring. That supported the law of dominance, or the principle of dominance, and it worked with his law of segregation. Now, in order to keep track of each different generation, Mendel gave a name to these generations. The parent generation he abbreviated with P for parent generation, and the first offspring generation he labeled the family 1 generation, or F1 generation. In order to prove his law of segregation, he crossed 2 offspring from the F1 generation. Let's take a look at that next. Here's our F1 generation, and they're going to make their alleles, their sex cells, or gametes rather. There's a dominant gamete and a recessive allele gamete from each of the 2 F1 parents. There's a dominant and there's a recessive allele gamete. Again, they segregate. Now I'm going to use colors to represent the different potential offspring that could form here. So we'll say this gamete crossed with this gamete, and that would give us an offspring with a genotype. The word genotype represents the types of alleles in there, with 2 dominant. The next type of cross we might get would be the recessive allele with this dominant allele, and that would give us a dominant plus a recessive zygote. Another combination still could take this recessive allele from this gamete and this gamete's recessive allele, and that would produce for us a zygote with 2 recessive alleles. And then we'll use purple here. If we crossed this gamete with this gamete, we would get the same as this, a dominant from this parent and a recessive from the other parent. How would these turn out? We would have a purple flower. We would have another purple flower. We would have another purple flower. And finally, we would have 1 out of every 4 flowers be white. So the white flower does not disappear from the face of the earth. It still exists. It just hides as a recessive genotype. Now, a couple of names that we use to explain what we're seeing here are genotype and phenotype. The genotype represents the zygote and gametes and the type of allele they have, which is dominant or recessive. Genotypes in zygotes, fertilized cells, are given names like homozygous, dominant, or homozygous recessive, right here, or heterozygous, right here and right here. Those terms refer to whether there's 2 dominant alleles, 2 recessive alleles, or 1 of each for heterozygous. There's a simpler way to draw this combination. That way is invented a long time ago by a person whose last name was Punnett, and we call it the Punnett square. P-U-N-N-E-T square. If we are crossing 2 heterozygous individuals, like this, we can put one individual with its segregated alleles on one side of the square. Not a very good P there, sorry. And we could put the other individual on the top of the square with its segregated alleles. And we'd simply draw a square. From that point, we fill in the combinations. This square lines up with a homozygous dominant. This square lines up with the dominant allele plus the recessive allele for heterozygous, as does this square. And finally, this square gives us the homozygous recessive. In either case, we have one white flower and 1, 2, 3 purple flowers.